Me again, back for another video. I wanted to talk today and give some information about where you can find some useful sources if you want to do some further reading on nutrition. Now, obviously, I've given the link to my blog many times before, but I will put that in the description box of this video. You can also get it off my YouTube channel homepage, and there is information there if you want to do reading. But I'm really talking about other sources, not including my own writing. The first port of call I would suggest is that you could look in at books, and it's very difficult to make particular comments on individual books because the video would take too long. I have done a video previously on some book reviews, and that would be a good place to start. And there were some books there that I gave a quick overview of, and you know, those books were reasonable books, but there are many others. And really what I wanted to do today is give you the information so that you'd know whether the book is a reliable source of information. The first thing to really look at when you read a nutrition book is to go to the ends of the chapters or the end of the book and see if original research has been cited. Now, this is not always the case. There are some very good nutritional books that have been written without citing original research, and it's not the only defining factor of a good nutritional book. But generally, although publishers I think don't really like it, generally most in-depth and in-depth nutrition books that have reliable information in them will generally cite the sources of that information. Usually you would cite information, cite sources within the text. Most books, most popular nutrition books will try and keep the text tidy, and all of the citations will be moved either to the end of the chapter or the end of the book in chapter order. So if you flick to the end of a book and you can see original citations, you can usually assume, although it can't be, you know, it's not definitive, it can be assumed that that book has had a certain amount of research gone into it, and the research is actually based on original scientific studies. Now, most nutrition books of quality will do that, although there are exceptions. I can think of a couple off the top of my head that I've read that don't cite original sources, and really that's very difficult to know whether that book is going to be reliable unless you read it and then you actually go and try and find the information yourself. But as a general rule, if the book has citations in it, you can you know, at least you can go to those citations, which is what they're for, and you can check the information yourself. And this is really just a verification process. The reason for putting citations in is not to make yourself look intellectually superior. It's so that those people who are reading the information can verify it themselves. So there would be very little point writing a book and putting citations in that didn't verify the information, because somebody would be able to go through those citations and then they would be able to pull the book apart and be able to pull the concepts apart, because the citations wouldn't match what's being said in the book. But at least if you're interested in the topic, if you read the book, you're interested in it, you can firstly verify the information by going to the original sources, and secondly you can use those sources as a good area for further research, and in turn those research papers will have their own citations, and you can then read those citations, and this is how you build up knowledge on a particular topic. You have to do your research and follow the trail to go back in time and follow the research through. You know, it's in reverse, usually in reverse chronological order when you do that, because the most recent papers are usually cited on more modern studies. So that's a very good way. Buy a nutrition book in a subject that you like. check that it has citations, and then you can go to those citations for further information. So it not only shows that the original writing is reliable, but it also provides you with further material that you can then go and look at and create a more in-depth picture of what it is that you're trying to study. Another place to get reliable nutrition information, and again this is not always the case, you can go to textbooks. Now I've got a thing about nutritional textbooks, because most of the ones that are aimed at undergraduate level tend to be out of date. There are some very good textbooks, and there are some very let's say ancient historical textbooks that contain information from maybe 3 or 4 decades ago. Again, I have made recommendations before. Advanced Nutrition in my book review video is a textbook that I use. It's very expensive. It's I think it's well over £100 now, but that's one of the best nutrition textbooks that I've come across. And again, you can go to the end of the chapters and all of the material in there is cited, and therefore you can go to the original sources of the material. And it's a textbook like that is written in a particular way. It's not written in the same style as a popular science book that you maybe get off the shelf in somewhere like a popular high street bookshop. It's more of a specialized book. It's designed for those people that perhaps postgraduates, those people that are actually researchers themselves, and it's really more like a review of the scientific literature to give someone a general overview, and again allow them to go and find their own sources by pulling all those sources together and giving somebody the ability to have a really reasonably in-depth understanding of the literature without having to do that research yourself. So the first port of call, if you want to improve your nutrition knowledge, is perhaps a popular science book with citations that you can then go and do further reading. The next level up would be to go to a textbook, something like Advanced Nutrition, which I think is by Groff and Gropper, but I'll put the link to the book, the latest edition of the book, in the description of this video. So there's 2 alternatives, and somebody that's a neophyte that's never done any reading on nutrition before, I would suggest that perhaps you buy a popular nutrition book first, because they tend to be easier to read and they tend to have less scientific terminology in them. And then if you progress and you're reading those books and you're happy and confident that you're absorbing the information, I would move maybe to an academic textbook like Advanced Nutrition. Again, I don't think it's particularly hard to understand if you have a basic understanding of nutrition, but there is terminology in there. There is an expectation that you will understand, for example, what an amino acid is, and the structure of a fatty acid. Although there are diagrams there to help you, and you can always look them up. You can always look these structures up. There is an understanding when it's written that you maybe have a certain level of scientific knowledge. So for some people, I understand you might not have that knowledge, in which case a popular science book may be a little bit easier. If you're confident that you've read, if you're happy with textbooks and you want to go to the next level, the next level really is to go to the original research studies. And this is where the most satisfying, I think the most satisfying feedback from understanding nutrition comes from. If you can read the original research, you don't really need to rely on other people to read it for you and then provide a review of it. Professional scientists are obviously trained to read the research and understand it's quite daunting for those people that aren't trained in science, and maybe they haven't done a degree. They obviously don't have a PhD, but that doesn't mean that you can't teach yourself. Really, there's nothing overly complex about original research papers and going to the original research. There is a certain language that science is written in, and it takes a while to get used to it, but it's not particularly hard. And once the terminology has been terminology barrier has been overcome, the way certain things are worded, really they're actually quite easy to read. And I would recommend that you try every now and then to delve into the original research in order to be able to find those nuggets of information that may be missing from from lots of popular science books. There's so many scientific research papers. It's very difficult to put them all into popular science books and all into textbooks, and you do come across scientific papers that have these nuggets of information in that you won't find anywhere else. They've just been overlooked, and they can be a goldmine for very useful nutritional information. So where would you go if you decided that you wanted to have a look at some original research papers? Where would you go? Well, you could go directly to many of these journals have an online content, and two of the ones that I use quite frequently are the Journal of Nutrition and the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They're two of the commonly used and commonly cited nutrition journals. They have a slightly different slant on nutrition. The Journal of Nutrition tends to incorporate a lot of animal nutrition. So when you're reading through the content pages, you may find studies that are done with pigs, studies that are done with dogs, studies that are done with cats. So it's more of a general nutrition journal that involves not just humans. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition is based on its name involves clinical nutrition, so it's usually the association between nutrition and disease, and therefore there is a lot, for example, of clinical trials, including mainly centered around humans. So they have a slightly different slant on nutrition, but they both contain very interesting and readable papers. There are reviews in there. Every now and then there'll be a review of a particular subject, and generally they have access to some of their past studies. I think they have started actually limiting what you can read, but you can certainly read some of the more recent studies, the whole papers, rather than just the abstract. And that's quite an important thing to stress when you go into the original research. If you're a beginner and you've never done it before, it's a good idea to maybe just read the abstract. The abstract will give you an overview of what is in the study as a whole. It's a précis of the paper, including a small amount of the background information, a couple of lines, then a couple of lines including an aim and a hypothesis, a couple of lines of method, a couple of lines of results, a couple of lines of discussion, and then a sentence of conclusion. So you can read the abstract and get an overview of the study as a whole. The disadvantage of that is that you will miss some of the nuances within the data, and often you will find that there are quite interesting things within the study that aren't placed in the abstract. And so if you don't read the study as a whole, sometimes you will miss things, but generally if you read the abstract you'll get an overview of the paper, and it's very unusual for the abstract not to reflect the data that's in the study. You do sometimes come across abstracts that are worded in ways that give a conclusion or a slant that is slightly different to the data that they have, and that's possibly a bit disingenuous, but it's quite rare. So there is usually a good correlation there. But I would encourage you to try and read the paper as a whole. The most important sections of the paper are generally you'll have an introduction to start with, and if you read the introduction that will give you the background information as to why it's important to study this particular topic. It will also indicate what's been found out before, what's been found out previously in studies, and what is the piece of information that's missing that has allowed these researchers to want to fill that gap. And that's usually what's the introduction. So it gives you a good overview of reading an introduction for example, a paper on cardiovascular disease will give you actually quite a good overview of the factors surrounding cardiovascular disease in that area of study. So even the introductions, reading them in isolation, can actually be quite useful. The method is probably a little bit more advanced. Some of the terminology in the method may be a little unfamiliar to those people that are not trained scientists, but you can generally pick up what's being done. There is certain terminology that's used, but once you get the hang of it, there's nothing really too complex in the method. It's just like a recipe. It's just a description of what the researchers did in order to be able to collect the data. And the reason that the method is given is so that somebody else could repeat the study exactly, in exactly the same way, using the same supplement, the same number of participants, the same type of participants. So all this detail is put down so that somebody would be able to repeat the study. Then if you go to the next section, which will be the results section, this will be where you will find graphs, you will find tables, you will find the data, and it won't be the raw data, it will be data that's been worked up into a particular viewable format to give the reader an overview of what the main findings of the study was or were, if there's more than one finding, and it's usually split into sections with subheadings, so it's fairly easy to follow. And the results section is probably the hardest part of most papers to read. And you may have to read the results section 3 or 4 times before you get a full understanding of what's been done, and that's just because data manipulation of data, statistical tests, it's not the sort of thing you can understand the first time you read it, unless you're familiar with that area of study and it's perhaps your particular expert, it's your area where you're an expert. Generally, if if it falls outside of your expertise, it's usually something you may have to read 3 or 4 times before you fully understand what the implications of the data are. Now, if you don't understand the data and there's bits that you're not too familiar with, you can go to the discussion, and the authors of the paper will actually discuss the data, and they will lead you through what the main findings were and where that fits into findings from other studies as well. So really, the discussion is really a taking of the main findings and relating them to other people's findings to try and fill the gap. This was the purpose of doing the study. There was a research question, a gap in the nutritional literature, and the discussion is a section that aims to try and fill that gap. So sometimes reading the discussion before you read the results is a good idea, and then going back to the results again, or if you've already read them, or reading them for the first time after you've read the discussion, is actually quite a good way of doing it, because the discussion gives you some kind of context of where those results are important and why they fit into other studies. Then when you read the results, it makes a little bit more sense. And then there's usually a small conclusion, which will be a paragraph or so in terms of summing up what the author feels the main conclusion of the study was. And then again, there's a list of citations. All the material within any statement that has been made will be cited, and so therefore at the end there will be a reference section where the material, the full references of the cited material will be, and therefore you can, if it's an online journal, you can usually click on them and it will take you to the study, and therefore you can read you can read the original paper where that author found that information. In that way you can find studies that are on similar areas. And it's rewarding doing that, because it means that you don't have to rely on other people to find your nutrition information. Ultimately, most of the nutrition information that is in circulation has come from research. There are exceptions. There is anecdotal information there, and there is information from, for example, Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, that's maybe not yet been in the research. But generally, most of the information that you read nutritionally in popular books and on the internet will ultimately have come from research papers. So if you have the ability to go straight to the research papers and read them, then you can obviously go straight to the source of the information. It means you're less reliable on other people interpreting that information for you, because every time somebody interprets that information, there is a possibility they can put their own bias in their interpretation, which means that you're then reliant on the person, the author, not using bias, and that's very unlikely. Most authors have some kind of preconceptions and bias that they put in their viewpoint, and therefore, it's always a good idea to go to the original research. If you don't fancy reading about an actual study that's been done, a slightly watered down way of understanding nutritional research is to go to the reviews. A review is still it's still classed as an academic paper, and you will find them in the same journals that you find the original research studies. So original research studies are studies that have involve experimentation and a method, and they collect data. A review is usually written by an academic that is an expert in a particular field, and they will sum up the findings in a particular area or topic based on the studies that have been written to date in that area. Using really the most recent studies, they will collate all the studies together. They will collate together to write the review, which is more like a chapter in a book, and therefore it will be more of a summary of the current understanding, the current consensus, the current theories, and the current understanding of a particular direction and future direction of study. They're quite useful because they're a little bit easier sometimes to understand than the experimental studies, and you can actually get more out of them. Again, they are prone to bias because they are in some cases based on opinion, but there is data in there. There are usually graphs, there are usually tables, and obviously the material is well cited. It's very unusual that you would find a review that didn't have a good 3-4 pages of citations. They're usually very in-depth documents that review all of the current experimental studies in a particular area. They're very, I think they're very useful, and they're possibly a better place to start than the experimental studies. But obviously there are fewer of them. They're only generally written when there's enough experimental studies have been performed to collate them into a review. So they're not so common, and therefore you can actually get through the reviews in a journal, and you can actually read them all, and therefore it becomes a bit limiting in terms of your knowledge after a while. But if you're a novice and you're only starting, there's many reviews out there that you can obviously go to. And they're the sort of things that will be good PDFs to keep in folders on particular topics so that you can refer back to them. An excellent source of citations if you want further information as well. So where would you go if you wanted to perhaps look at some reviews? Well, obviously you can go to the websites of the journals, because the reviews are within their journals, and therefore you can search through. Sometimes if you just put in the keyword review, it will bring up all of the reviews in that particular journal. So if you went to the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition homepage, you go to the search bar, type in review, it will more than likely bring up those studies that are reviews, and therefore some of them you will be able to access, and you'll be able to have a look at some of the reviews there. If you don't want to go to a particular website, a particular journal homepage, you could go to Google Scholar. There are other sites that will search journals such as Medline. I use Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a page within Google that will only search academic sources. So it will search textbooks, but mainly journals. And if you search Google Scholar, you put in your keywords. So let's say you put in cardiovascular disease, you put in homocysteine, and then you put in review. It will search for those papers that contain the keywords homocysteine, cardiovascular disease, and are reviews. If you obviously miss the word review, it will search for all papers with homocysteine and cardiovascular disease. So it's not a perfect way to search, because sometimes you need to know the terminology or the name of the paper. A better way to search is if you know the research group that is involved in a particular area of research, but obviously if you're not a scientist and you're not involved in research, it's quite difficult to build up that information. But you can usually find what you're looking for if you go to Google Scholar. The search, the reason I use it is because the search engine is quite good. I find some of the other ones are a little bit difficult sometimes to find the paper that you're looking for. But it's a very good way, and once you look down the list, you will be able to see, if you look to the right hand side of the list of papers, whether you can access the full PDF. And if you can obviously look at the whole paper in PDF form, and you can download that and print it out if you want to read it in a hard copy instead, which is quite useful, because then you can add your highlighting, and you can take it with you and read it when you've got time. You don't have to be sat in front of a PC. Although obviously you could put them on your tablet or your phone, and you could read them there. So that's really where you could get them from. And obviously, again, they will also search for textbooks, which there's some free textbooks on nutrition which are quite nice that you can find on the internet, and you can also read selective book chapters of particular academic texts, and even though it's not the whole book, there is useful information in there. And again, generally at the end of the chapter of any academic textbook, there will be a list of citations, which then encourages you to go and do further reading. Before I end this video, I just wanted to say something about selecting internet sites as a source of information. There are good internet sites that contain nutrition information. I've tried to always make mine as accurate as possible. I've tried not to add any hyperbole into it, and I've tried to be as honest and as unbiased as I can in terms of what I write. And there are other authors that have the same objective. I'm really interested in the truth, and I want to know how nutrition affects health. I don't sell anything. I don't have any product to sell. I don't do any advertising. So really, my nutrition blog is there as a way of me passing information that I've learned on to other people, and I hope it helps people to maintain their health. And there are many other people that write about nutrition that have the same desires, and they want to really just they want to share their knowledge with other people. However, there are sites that sell supplements. There are sites that sell advertising, and you do have to be careful, because obviously they may bias their content towards their ultimate goal, which is to make money. If the website's ultimate goal is really to make money, then you have to be careful about the how they select and how they portray their information. Often websites don't provide much in-depth background to the information that they provide, and some websites don't provide citations. So really, it's caveat emptor. You have to be very careful. You really got to do your own, you've got to have your own discernment as to whether you think the information is reliable or not. Obviously, any website that provides citations means that you can go and check that information. So if there are no citations, you have to take the author's word as being truthful, and you have to make that judgment call as to whether you think that is the right thing to do. I can't go through every single website and say whether I believe that they are correct or not, and I wouldn't do that anyway. That's for the individual reader to come to that judgment. Some people may think that, for example, my website contains information that's not correct, but I've always tried to put a citation there to support any argument that I put forward. So again, while something I say may not be a consensus, the individual thought that I have is always cited, and therefore the reader can then make up their own minds as to whether they think that is therefore the truth, or whether that study was erroneous, whether it should be dismissed or taken in context. And that's really where you need to be if you're going to be able to use information and have good discernment in nutrition. You need to be able to look at the picture as a whole. You need to be able to take information. You need to have a good background knowledge of nutrition in order so that you can really take the pieces of individual data that you collect from various sources and ascertain whether they fit into that picture. You've always got to be prepared to change your mind if you come across data or information that challenges what you already think is perhaps the case. And it's those sort of people that are open-minded about nutrition, those people that are prepared to take on new data, take on new concepts, take on new theories, always look at new information and adapt that information to what they already know. It's those people that will grow, and it's those people that will become very knowledgeable on nutrition. So I hope this video has been helpful. You now hopefully, along with my video on book reviews, you should have some reading material that you could go to if you want some more in-depth study, because I do understand that and what I've always tried to do with my blog is I've tried to make it technically challenging. I didn't want to create a blog and a YouTube channel that was at a very simplistic level, because there are many other people that do that already, and they do it very well. I wanted to provide something that was technically challenging, and a lot of people will be turned off by that information, but there are people out there that want that information. There are people that want to be challenged technically, and there are people that want to take their nutrition knowledge and improve it, and they want to move up and expand that knowledge to be able to become experts in a field. And so I hope this is in this video and this YouTube channel is some way going towards filling that gap to help you to get where you want to go with your nutritional knowledge. So as always, eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video, and in the meantime, please take care.